Yeah. Just my take on things. My answer to number 2. Guided discovery. Identifying, challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind, negative thoughts release. Those cognitive distortions.
All right. Welcome to episode 3 of Peplow's Ghosts. My name is Dan Wesemann. I am joined by my esteemed colleagues, Sean Convoy, Melissa Chapman, and Kate Melino. Hopefully you've all had a chance to listen to the first 2 podcasts and are back for more. We're really excited to kind of keep going with this, and hopefully we develop a real listening audience and get everybody here to like, subscribe, and comment. So we're going to focus on psychoanalysis and psychodynamic approach here. This is obviously a podcast about psychotherapy. So we're really going to kind of get into this sort of topic and really kind of get what everybody's thinking about. I figure what I'm going to do here is kind of do a bit of a word association. I'm trying not to get too risque, but hey, we'll see where this podcast goes. Maybe this will be the hot podcast. We'll talk a little bit about sex, bring some people in, get really kind of interesting here. Before we get too much into it, do want to really thank Sean, your alumni, who's made this amazing song about PMHNPs and really kind of welcomed us into this episode, and they'll be welcoming us out. And maybe, Sean, if you wouldn't mind giving a shout out to your alumni here to say thanks.
Absolutely. So the alumni is when I was at Virginia Commonwealth University. The person who created the song, his name is Marcelli Pascal Rodriguez. Marcelli owns his own private practice in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia. He's a rock star in many different ways. I didn't even know he had musical talents when he was a student. And this was actually a response to a homework assignment. Interestingly enough, it was actually a discussion forum assignment. And yes, he got the A.
And that's all that matters. No, it's great. He's definitely multi-talented for sure. Exciting person to know. And so, yes, definitely shout out. Maybe in the future we'll have him on the podcast. That would be kind of exciting as well. So look forward to that. So anyone interested, we can probably look and share if you want them to hear more of that song. That's part of our intro and outro. So, well, let's get into it a little bit, talking again about psychoanalysis, psychodynamic approach. One of those approaches, I think it's where you got to start, right? Where kind of everything began. You know, Peplow's Ghosts, that's what we're kind of talking about. Hildegard Peplow, that was kind of the start for psych mental health nursing. But obviously here with psychoanalysis, that's where everything started. It still kind of blows me away, this idea that, you know, and I'll say long ago, I'm plenty old, so it's going to be even older than I am. There was actually a time where talking to people was kind of not considered an intervention, not considered to be of any therapeutic value. And so thank goodness for our good old friend Sigmund Freud to kind of discover that, I guess, or to at least add an evidence base. So I figured what we do today is just kind of do a quick word association. I'm going to kind of throw out some words associated with psychoanalysis, and then I'm going to ask my esteemed colleagues here to kind of give their thoughts and what they think about when they hear the terms. So I'll start with the first one, which is where we got to start. Freud. What sort of thoughts or images go through your head when I say Freud?
Used enough cocaine to hell a horse.
That's Robin Williams, right? That's what is it? Good Will Hunting. Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's great. Is that true? Does anybody know that? I think I know he did do some experimenting with cocaine.
Definitely.
I think that's before we knew cocaine was kind of a problem. But yes, great quote, Sean. Thank you. What do other people think about when you hear the word Freud?
Yeah, I think about glasses and a pipe. And the couch and, the various phases or stages, oral, anal, so on, penis envy. I think a lot of those terms are really, sort of in popular culture too.
They are for sure. Yeah.
Sometimes the pipe is just a pipe, right?
Exactly.
I don't know what this says about me, but penis envy came to mind. And I'm like, oh God, that's the first thing that I thought of.
Yeah.
I'm going to slant on that, right? Like lots of contributions and all. So, it's a different time maybe.
No, I agree. Thanks, Melissa. That's why I said maybe this will be the hot episode that everybody kind of giggles through. But it is, I think of it too, when I was, when I was young, man, I was like 18, 19 years old. You kind of hear, I think everybody knows about Sigmund Freud. There's been movies, books written about him in popular presses and things like that. So I always remember kind of having this argument with a bunch of friends that, psychoanalysis and Sigmund Freud really kind of boiled everything down to everything we do is about sex. either trying to get sex or these kind of things. And so obviously that's a very naive view of those kind of things before I got my education, but that was my argument. And I remember having a few intense arguments under, assisted with some golden throat charmers in my day, kind of, imbuing a little bit on those kind of things. And really, yeah. So I love it that we've kind of gotten into it. It's one of those things, but yeah, penis envy, wanting to have sex with your mother. I mean, all these kind of things that we are so taboo, but it's just like, that's not everything he's about, but that is one of the first things you think of. So, yeah. Any other thoughts?
On a more general basis, unconscious, and, whether it's, oh, sure, everything's about, what happened with your mother when you were growing up on the sillier side, right, or the pop culture side, but also legitimizing that's a thing that's real, and then building from there.
Yeah.
What I think also about him, I see him almost, excuse the pun, but as a transitional object, because without him, we wouldn't have had the likes of Jung, Beck, or Rogers. So while I don't necessarily ascribe on a daily basis to a lot of the psychodynamic principles, you can't deny the fact that it transformed the discourse, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like evolution, right? Some of the things that come out of evolution, you're like, the dodo bird, things like that. You have to kind of go down some of these rabbit holes to get to where it actually makes sense and is actually helpful for people. So, yeah.
For sure. And I would say too, even for those of us who don't practice, psychoanalysis, we use so much psychodynamic ideas in our, even what we teach students in Psych NP school, the biopsychosocial formulation, that whole psychological piece is completely psychodynamic.
Yeah.
But it's not something we necessarily say explicitly, I think.
Right.
Yeah. It is something, yeah, it continues to live in medical journals, right? I mean, there's so many threads that kind of go here. And that's always fascinated me too, is this idea that it's still around and physicians still like it. They're still drawn to it. It still becomes kind of an evidence-based, preference of, having somebody do psychoanalysis or psychodynamic approaches and such. And I think, the important thing one of the things I think of when I hear the word Freud too, is I had a colleague tell me about that one of his first books was the 200 Eels of Sigmund Freud. Has anyone ever heard of that? It's out of press now, of course, but you can pay a bunch of money on Amazon if you wanted to. But I think it's 200 or 300 Eels of Sigmund Freud was this idea that he was a physician, right? And he was dissecting eels because people didn't understand how eels reproduced. And so he dissected over 200 eels in this, adventure to try and figure out how did eels reproduce? Because obviously they lived down in the ocean, especially in the 1920s, 10s, whatever, people aren't diving down that deep. And so it was one of those things that he kind of looked at. So it is one of those things that, as he moved into this psychoanalysis and, did enough cocaine to kill a horse type of thing, that medical approach of, dissecting and looking at multiple case episodes to develop a theory is, fascinating for me too, that kind of dynamic of Sigmund Freud and who he was. So interesting book. Yeah. Next word, ego. What do people think of when they hear the word ego?
Well, consistent with the term, when I hear ego, I'm automatically reflecting on self, and that's what provides some context into my silence. How's that?
There you go.
Oh, nice.
Very nice. Very twisty, Sean. Very good. Nice. Awesome.
Yeah, I think, ego is usually sort of, considered to be a bad thing. You have a big ego, you're an egotist, I know that's not really how Freud meant it, but I think that's how it's often used.
Yeah, I do think, yeah. What's that, Melissa? I'm sorry.
Oh, that's where my mind went too. Just like the ego means something, especially now in the context that we are all living in, at least in the United States. It's unfortunate because it does mean self, like what Sean was saying, but popular culture and common understanding of that word has been co-opted in multiple ways.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Probably feeding what we just talked to. I mean, yeah, we all think of Freud as kind of sex and wanting to have sex with our mother and things, but yeah, ego's kind of been taken that away too. So, but yeah, the sense of self and yeah, egotistical. I guess I'm super nerdy. When I think of ego, I think of the id and superego.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I tell this a bit too. I think of that movie, The Mask, with Jim Carrey, and how he kind of goes through this phase of starting in the super ego of just really being real anxious and reserved, and then he starts to put on this mask and becomes that id of super pleasure and very promiscuous, and then kind of balances that out with the ego. So sometimes I think ego is kind of that balance of kind of doing what you need to do, but also having some fun along the way too. It's I remember I saw something somewhere. I'm going to forget the reference here, but it's like when we find our partners, there's a saying, we find a partner to grow old with, but we really should find a partner to stay young with. So we continue to have fun and continue to do silly and goofy things with people as we get older too. So that's kind of a cool thing.
I also think it's important to have a partner who knows the signs and symptoms of a stroke.
Very good. Yeah, that's great. Awesome. So a couple other terms, interpretation, getting kind of technical, but what do you think of when you think of interpretation?
Mindful of, again, the idea that, silence in a podcast is an anathema. I think, when I hear the term interpretation, my mind kind of goes to the dynamics of transference and countertransference.
Okay.
And that, quite frankly, the interpretation from either side of the aisle between the patient and the provider is kind of riddled with that. So,
yeah.
And I would also say, psychodynamically interpreting what patients are saying in the context of their childhood and their unconscious and their subconscious and all of those things. Yeah,
I think of it as the biggest problem with psychodynamic approach, psychoanalysis, because I think it's so subjective. In God's, that's why we can't do randomized controlled trials with these kind of approaches, because can't do this. But interpretation is such a part of it, and like you just said, Kate, it's a part of how we listen to what someone says and we make these interpretations about, is this their unconscious speaking? Is it peeking out now? Those kind of things, and I always talk to students too that this approach. You mentioned the couch earlier too, and you see this on movies and things. You see the therapist kind of with a notepad writing some things down, maybe falling asleep, right? You just kind of, sleeping through half the session. I mean, there's this kind of idea, but I think it really is a very active role where you have to kind of very much be thinking about, where is this coming from? What's being said? What's being not said? That, meta-analysis, listening with that third ear type of thing that needs to go along. And I think that a lot of that goes back to kind of that psychodynamic approaches and things like that too. So yeah, I guess, when I hear the word interpretation, I always think of that's kind of maybe it's its strength and its weakness all at the same time, but it is so subjective. It's, because I think everybody's going to have different interpretations about what people say and how, what they're going to focus on in a session and things like that. So
as you bring that up, I'm thinking, perhaps I'm speaking out of turn here, but I think to some degree that psychoanalysis has been more commonly aligned with our physician colleagues historically over the years. There are, in fact, nurse practitioners who are doing it and clinical nurse specialists doing it really, really well. But we have to acknowledge that probably the numbers lean more in that direction. And I think, the nature of psychodynamic psychotherapy, which is quite frankly a long time commitment, is a lot more internally consistent with that model. Whereas with advanced practice nurses, we're typically a little bit more, excuse the term, surgical in our approaches here. That's why, in my mind, I think about, I train my students with cognitive therapy or solution-focused behavioral therapy or motivational interviewing. But not a lot of patients have the time commitment or the resource, quite frankly, to be able to commit to a long-term psychodynamic psychotherapy relationship. Could some benefit from it? I'm sure of it. But I also think that some degree that the business of psychiatry and mental health is moving in a different direction, kind of away from that, because it's a large time and resource commitment that everybody can support.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, go Kate.
I was going to say, I think that's such a good point, Sean. I mean, sort of like, classic psychoanalytic therapy, you're there twice a week. It's, that's a huge commitment. You're working together for years. I think that doesn't necessarily match the reality of the folks we work with. And, another thing that comes to my mind about interpretation is, my understanding is that, one of the critiques of psychoanalysis or psychodynamic therapy is, it's quite culturally bound. And we're working with people who are coming from a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different places and cultures. And, so that's something really important to keep in mind in terms of potential limitations.
Yeah. How do we keep that out of our sessions, bringing our own cultural bias and sensitivities to those conversations. Because that was the two things, when you guys are speaking, I think this is the term that kind of has come up from psychodynamic approaches too, is just, they're treating the worried well, right? The people who are not really, really sick, but pretty sick, and they have the resources. And, typically, Freud's foundation is Caucasian women that were kind of middle to upper class, that were able to kind of come and pay cash for these. I mean, they didn't have insurance back in the 1920s and things like that. So that's a great perspective. And I think the second thing that I thought too is, as you were saying, Sean, as well, is this, is interpretation everywhere? I mean, is it in every approach? I mean, how do we defend against interpretation, even doing, cognitive behavioral therapy or other sorts of approaches? I always worry about that too. And how do we teach our students these sort of things, but protecting ourselves from, when a patient tells us this is the problem, not to kind of, oh, this is the problem, versus, kind of giving it some time. And maybe there's something behind that problem. Maybe there's some further interpretation I need to do that helps me further understand that individual. And yeah, maybe it is cultural. Maybe there's some other social determinants of health things that are going on that are, nobody really wants to talk about. Maybe that's more shameful than talking about wanting to have sex with your mom. I don't know. Maybe not.
I think that's kind of,
got to bring it back. Yeah.
what that kind of helps me with is, it brings me back to this idea that over the years, there are certain patients where my principal mode of therapy is cognitive therapy, but there are some patients, for whatever reason, don't effectively respond to that approach. Now, one possible explanation is that I'm not really good that day. Another possible explanation is that they've got some stuff that is probably a little bit more focused in their childhood that's not as accessible through cognitive therapy. So from my perspective, it's almost like after a trial of cognitive therapy, if they're not responding, that's sometimes an indication for me to say, I think you might benefit from somebody with some different skills around psychoanalysis to kind of explore that. But just because there's a problem in the past doesn't mean that the patient is ready, willing, or able to tap into that. So I think that's the trick, is that, not making a decision based upon what I think, but based upon what the patient wants and needs.
Yeah. Good stuff. Yeah. It's one of those things. It's, like I said, this is where it all begins, right? And it continues to follow us today. And so that's a question. Actually, I was just at the conference the other day, this last week out in Reno. Just get a shout out to the AANP fall conference out there. And a presenter was up there and got the question that I think we all kind of freeze up on a little bit is, when you see a patient, when should you start psychotherapy and when should you start medications? Where's that line? And I think we had that maybe in our episode 2, or I believe Kendra, who's not here, it's Kendra Delaney, who's not here today, but I think she mentioned that too, that her preference is everybody gets psychotherapy. It doesn't matter. It's just like, hey, give it to everybody and see what kind of washes out. But that is one of those, drawbacks in our field as well, is, determining who could benefit from what form of therapy. I mean, we got the evidence base, but like you were saying, Sean, sometimes when you get to work with people, yeah, maybe cognitive behavioral therapy isn't going to work until they start working through some of that dynamic stuff. So, yeah.
I think that's the art and the science part of the whole job, right?
And it's the negotiation part, right? You might have the most wonderful ideas about treatment, and but if your patient doesn't want to do it, it's moot.
Yeah. Right. So the last two, items for just a word association were kind of things we've kind of already come up with. I mentioned unconscious. I think, Melissa, you mentioned that a little bit just to start us off, and then defense mechanism, which is not a word. It's 2 words, but kind of a phrase. But what do you guys think of when you hear unconscious or you hear defense mechanisms?
One of the first things I share with my patients when we, that's a Freudian slip, my students, when we jump in, is literally the first lesson I give my students is, don't take away a defense you can't otherwise replace in real time. So I think a lot of times when I teach students about cognitive therapy and we learn about the cognitive distortions, for them it's like, ooh, I found the cognitive distortions, I must neutralize it. No, probably good to recognize it, acknowledge it, but not necessarily try to neutralize it. So when we think about defenses, I think defenses serve a purpose. And, I've seen a lot of really good clinicians who have great skills who neutralize a patient's defense, and they say, I'll see you in 4 weeks. So we have to be really thoughtful about this idea of defense. It's not a bad thing. Quite frankly, it's allowed them to survive to present. So I think what it requires us to do is to actually be respectful of it.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Oh, yeah. I love that, Sean. Yeah.
Maybe take a step back. I want to ask Melissa, do you know what Freudian slip means?
Oh, yes, of course.
Everybody's heard it, right? I mean, but can you define it? I mean, it's one of those weird things. When I heard you say that, I was like, "Ooh, does everybody know what that means?" I know what it means, kind of, but yeah, if I give a definition, how do you define a Freudian slip?
Isn't it some this is like the uninformed, right? Like, or like the psych undergrad person talking. um, like some unconscious motivation, desire that slips through in your language,
Yeah,
or what you really want or mean, or
exactly. That's well said. Yeah,
correct me.
yeah. No, that's well said. And I love that your slip came out because you're saying your students are patients. I know I frequently think of that too. I hope my students aren't offended by that, but not that I necessarily think the students are ill or broken in some way, but it's a growth process, but that you see both with patients and students. So,
Yeah.
any other thoughts about unconscious or defense mechanisms?
When I think about unconscious, I think about the iceberg and how much there is below the surface. And it also makes me think about, it really ties in with what we know about neurology, which is, I'm going to mess up the number, but, you have something like, I don't know, 1 million or billion thoughts per, X interval, and you're only conscious of like 3% of them, right? And so I love that alignment, I think, because it illustrates the same thing from two different angles, which is that there's so much going on with us that we just aren't aware of, that nonetheless really affects us.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think it's like computers. We try to make computers like brains so much, but the brains do so many things. It's right now, it's regulating my heart rate. It's regulating the oxygen level in my brain, and I'm having a thought about what I'm going to have for lunch after that. I mean, yeah, it all at the same time. And, how does a computer do that? I mean, I guess maybe some quantum theories will kind of get to that, but it's amazing how the brain works and the mind. Yeah, that whole dynamic. Yeah, honestly, when I hear defense mechanisms, I kind of have a cold shiver go up my spine. It always makes me think that that's something I got to memorize for a quiz or a board exam. So, and I always tell students too, it's like I probably have memorized this and forgotten these more times than I care to remember. But yeah, I think it's very relevant. And obviously, if you're practicing from this approach, these things kind of forward and backwards. But they're relevant. I mean, it's one of those things you just keep thinking about and kind of going off. So, yeah. And I love that iceberg analogy too. Yeah, that's that 2/3 below the water type of thing. Things are just bubbling there. The one thing I do struggle with unconscious though, and at least, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think, Freud was very much, the unconscious is really unattainable. The Freudian slips is where these little kind of gaps come through and maybe fantasies or dreams, they kind of, percoled through too. I don't know. I guess I struggle with that idea. I think I don't, it's free association where you just have that person talk and just kind of wander around, in their pasture of their mind to kind of see where that ends up. Is that where you kind of find the unconscious, or is the unconscious totally unavailable to people? I have a hard time struggling with this idea that it's totally unavailable to us. Like somehow in my mind, I've made this huge thing that's 2/3 beneath the surface. And there's a brick wall. There's a huge thing. I can't get to it any way, shape or form. It's just, so sometimes I struggle with that kind of concept a little bit too. So if anybody
at present, we're kind of in a unique position with reevaluating the use of psychedelics to kind of get different exposures to that, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, if Freud was, doing LSD as opposed to cocaine, maybe things would be totally different.
That's right.
That would be awesome. Yeah. Or maybe he did. Maybe it was laced with cocaine was laced with LSD. Who knows? So I kind of brought up a little bit about, fantasies and dreams and things. I don't know if we want to talk much about, does anybody get into dream analysis and kind of get into those sort of things? That's one of those things, again, before I went back to school, I saw that, I think, on some library book, dream analysis. It was a thick book and I read through it and I think I left it kind of more confused than when I first started reading it. But I know it's one of these ideas that if you dream about this, it means that, and those kind of things. And one thing I talk to my patients a lot about is, because I've had patients definitely tell me that they dream about dying, and that really makes them unnerved and really, freaks them out. I usually kind of say, well, if you're dreaming about dying, it doesn't mean you're going to die. And knock on wood, I have never had a patient die. I always think of that like in a movie type of thing. I'm telling them they're not going to die, and then I see their obituary 2 weeks later. I hope that never happens. But it's the theory in dream analysis is that you dream of dying, and that it's something it's changing in your life. Like you're going to move, you're going to change jobs, you're going to get a divorce or something like that you're anticipating this kind of change. Do you guys have any other like dream analysis or dream things that you kind of think of when?
I don't typically bring up the concept or the construct of dreams in therapy with patients, but sometimes my patients will bring it in. And then from my view of this is that I default to the patient's perspective and perception of the experience, and I ask them to identify their meaning. So more often than not, it just tends to validate the concerns they have when they're awake.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, that's what I do too. Thanks, Sean, for clarifying. Yeah, I definitely am not spending time asking people to dream. Although I know that is an approach, right? You have them kind of write down their dreams and things, but that's not something I'm typically doing. But they may bring it up to me, like I had this horrible dream, or talk about insomnia. People struggle with sleep a lot, and so yeah, they'll tell me those things. But
So we've been talking about consciousness, levels of consciousness. I did many years ago try to lucid dream and make myself lucid dream for
cool.
lots of I mean, I thought it would just be cool. But I'm a very deep sleeper, and I could not figure it out. And I wasn't willing to like buy something that, when you got to REM sleep, it would alert you somehow, and so that you could lucid dream. But my husband does. My partner can lucid dream, and he talks about doing it. So I don't know what that means to this conversation, but that's always interested me.
Does your husband find it therapy? I'm sorry.
What it means to me is I'm jealous. I would love the opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
Right? Oh man, I just on the flip side, I can sleep anywhere. I just
Right.
give me a couch, give me a blanket.
I love it. Does your husband find it therapeutic or find it beneficial?
That is a great question. I know that he has done things in his dream because he knows that he's dreaming. Probably he's a very grounded individual. So maybe that does help him. I don't know. I will ask him this evening.
Yeah. I assume he does because he keeps doing it, but yeah. Interesting. That's great. Well, let's finish up. I think we're getting close on time here. So, the tail end here, I want to kind of talk a little bit about, how Freud is kind of infiltrated. And I think we talked a little bit about this too, how it's infiltrated kind of our popular literature as well as movies and things like that. I kind of was looking up a little bit before the podcast. You've probably heard this before, like Sleeping Beauty, this idea that, someone falls asleep and then, the seven dwarfs kind of being a little bit representative of defense mechanisms and having to kind of navigate those defense mechanisms and then ultimately get that sort of thing. But there's a lot of, obviously, sexism implicit with these kind of interpretations too. Sleeping Beauty needs to be kissed by a man and all that good stuff. And then the second one, which I don't know if you listen to Malcolm Gladwell. He's the 10,000 times guy. You got to do things 10,000 times to get good at it. But he kind of had a whole podcast talking about Little Mermaid. Have you guys heard this interpretation?
No.
But very much about the same idea where, it's very psychodynamic that this woman loses her voice. And again, that a man has to kind of save the voice and bring it back. And it's how that kind of goes along with some of these kind of deep-seated, the losing your voice, you have to kind of go inward a lot and kind of do that sort of psychodynamic work to get out of that kind of tormented. And, it's one of those things when you watch it just on face value, you're like, I kind of like that show. And it was kind of, my kids liked it. And now that I think about it too much, I'm like, I don't know if I like it so much anymore. And yeah, I know. I'm like, yuck. Can they remake it? And I didn't see the newest one, but I don't know if they changed anything about that. But as far as the storyline, does anybody else kind of have any thoughts like that or any examples like from movies, other sorts of things that they kind of have psychodynamic?
Well, Dan, I had never thought of this until you just brought it up. But, I think actually a lot of Disney movies have this very sort of psychodynamic foundation, right? Like, the parent dies early in childhood and there's a lot of trauma and, they're working through that. So that's fascinating. I'll have to think about that more. Yeah.
And just to make your lives absolutely miserable once you watch it, just in the future, watch Aladdin again. And particularly when he's flying on the magic carpet, you're going to see all the houses below, and probably 75% of the houses are shaped like penises.
Now you can't unsee that, right?
You can never unsee it again. Absolutely.
I'm sure
let's finish
Freud
on.
would be proud.
All right. Well, let's finish on that. Houses looking like penises. No, but I think there's a couple other examples. Black Swan, I guess, has a lot of sexuality in it. I think there's a lot of dynamic in that. And then the other Jim Carrey, I don't know, maybe I'm a big Jim Carrey fan. The Eternal and Spotless Mind, where he tries to erase that relationship. Yeah. So that idea that you can't really do that, you can't get rid of those kind of things. You got to learn how to live with it. And so, yeah. So again, thank you so much. Appreciate your time for listening to this. Another podcast will be coming out here hopefully in a week or two. And so again, as always, really beg you to like, subscribe, and put in the comments, and we'll listen to you next time. Enjoy the music on the way out. Yeah.
The conclusions having to always be right. Can be catastrophic like disaster will strike. Caught up in fallacies, either they're helpless or they assume responsibility. Personalization over generalization, global labeling, emotional reasoning. Too much salt like this, too much seasoning. They feel it, therefore it's true. Work hard until those thoughts are finally leaving, so you can be you. They feel it, therefore it's true. Work hard until those thoughts are finally leaving, so you can be you. Guided discovery. Identifying, challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind, negative thoughts release. Let it go. These cognitive distortions decrease until they cease. Yeah, guided discovery. Identifying, challenging your beliefs. Reframing your mind, negative thoughts release. Let it go. These cognitive distortions decrease until they cease.